Hello everyone, welcome to today's episode of Tea Time part of series where we go in depth with a member of our esteemed faculty here at LBS to know who they are, what they do and why, what drives them. I'm your host, Suresh Ghalsasi, academic co-rep of EMBA LJ 2021 cohort. I feel honored and privileged to be with today's guest. I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for him, founder of Executive MBA program and former dean of the London Business School, who received knighthood from UK government in 2001 and has CIMA gold medal and honorary doctorate from the London Business School and from 3 other universities. He has been the director of the Bank of England and has been non-executive chairman of the year in the public and non-for-profit sector. When faculty team was doing research for the show, we were so blown away for your achievements, sir, that we were not sure how to introduce you without spending at least 15 minutes. So please forgive me for the brief introduction. Professor Sir Andrew Likierman, welcome and thank you so much for coming to speak to us today.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here.
Same here, sir. Today, we are going to talk about your experience on boards, but before doing that, I would also like to ask you a couple of general questions. To begin with, can you please tell us about your time as a dean? I bet you are glad that you did not have COVID-19 to deal with.
Well, I must confess, this is not an easy time. This really isn't an easy time for anybody running any organization. So I very much sympathize with Francois and indeed with anybody else involved. I did have a little problem myself. I mean, I had the result of the financial crisis, so it wasn't quite as dramatic as this. But I think if you're in any position of leadership, you must expect that things don't always go exactly how you might wish.
Yes, yes, we all are aware of your immense contribution to fundraising for London Business School and joint efforts, and if I understand correctly, our prestigious library is also named after you. So we are thankful for that.
I should also say it's interesting because it's named the Likierman Library in honor also of my wife, because she was also very involved on the fundraising side.
Yes, we are aware of it was a joint effort with Dr. Myra and yourself. Yes, we are really thankful for a wonderful library and wonderful campus.
Thank you.
So you received a knighthood for your work on moving UK government finances from cash to an accruals basis through resource accounting and budgeting. I'm curious to know, how has that changed your life?
The resource accounting and budgeting, or the knighthood?
That is what it says.
Well, look, it was a great honor to get this, and I was very proud to. And also, in some senses, it meant a lot to me because I spent 9 years on this project.
Yeah.
I left the London Business School to go on secondment for 2 years to the Treasury, and I stayed for 11 years to see this project through all the way from the beginning to the end. So I mean, it was, a feeling of huge satisfaction to be able to do that, and it's something which I feel very proud.
Absolutely, absolutely, no doubt about that. Everybody is aware of this immense contribution, and everybody loves to talk about it. So let's talk about your extensive experience of your boards. As I understand, you sat on 17 boards so far and still counting. So let's start with general discussion. So to begin with, what are the characteristics of a good board?
Well, I think if one looks at what you look for, and all of us, I'm assuming here everybody looking at this webinar is going to sit on a board at some time or other.
Yes.
And so if I think about the question, so what are the characteristics you have? I define it in terms of 8 different elements. Okay, now I'm not going to turn this into a lecture, so you can relax. I'm not.
No, we are happy.
Just to look at the things you might look for in a board. You're going to look for a good chair. Somebody has got to be a person who is able to chair well. That's absolutely essential in my view. You need the right people around the table, and you need good internal dynamics in terms of the way people interact with each other. So that's about the people. You also need, in terms of what the board discusses, you need to make sure the board is discussing what really matters and not just, anything that comes up. So the key issues, and in particular risk issues, I think in my view are very, very important as an agenda. The board's got to be good at doing business. I mean, spending hours and hours discussing something that doesn't need hours and hours is not a good use of everybody's time. So it needs to be efficient in the way it operates. And it has, in looking at what it does, it's not just a question of what's happening now. The board has to look into the future and say, what's coming along over the horizon? What have we got to be aware of? What are the opportunities we've got, as well as what are the threats we might face? So it's not just what's happening now. And also, finally, I'd say in terms of the way the board operates, the tone of the board, the culture of the board, it's got to be open. People have got to feel free to speak. Now, I'm sure all of us have been in situations where we felt, I'm not sure whether I should say something, Well, actually, that's very bad for a board, because you do need people to say, if they're worried about something or they've got something to contribute, they feel free to do so. So finally, though, it seems to me a board has got to be able to contribute something to the organization, because I think a good question for a board to ask itself is, look, if we didn't exist, who would notice? That is a question a board has to ask itself too. So these are the kinds of characteristics of a good board.
So now when we are talking about the boards, obviously there are different boards, different things. So, I mean, there can be, let's say, first of all, to begin with, how do the boards differ between countries?
Right. I mean, I think you're right to raise this, because in one sense, I've been talking about a more formal board, a board perhaps of a listed company, a board that has to undertake its business in a certain kind of way. There are, of course, many different kinds of boards. There are boards of listed companies, there are boards of subsidiaries, there are boards of, way down the organization which deal with things. And clearly the same rules don't apply to all of these. And also I differentiate between profit and not-for-profit boards, because these two are different. In the one case, there is a very clear focus on the shareholders and on profitability and so on. And on the other, there's a case of more social objectives and operating within a public accountability framework. And I would also say there's a difference between big boards of large organizations and boards of smaller organizations. You clearly don't need a very complicated organizational structure with a small company. With a large company, you need a lot of structure to make sure you're getting things right.
So you said about differences as depending on countries, larger and small organizations. Are there also differences between listed and private companies, or not-for-profit and for-profit organizations?
There are. I mean, so I've mentioned some of the ones of the for-profit and not-for-profit, and there too, if we think about the not-for-profit, their objectives are social objectives. Very often, we're not talking about things that are quite as tangible. And I'm glad you mentioned too the question of different countries, because boards operate differently in different countries. So there's not a single formula. I'm going to be talking more about an Anglo-Saxon style board. But even in continental Europe, boards have a different structure. They often have supervisory boards, so they have two-tier boards. And the way boards operate in different cultures is often very, very different. So one has to acknowledge the fact there isn't a kind of uniformity in everything one should do on a board. And I believe one has to be very sensitive to this, obviously. And as people do coming from all over the world to come to LBS, I'm really aware of the fact that you can't have a blueprint. So what I'll be saying has got to be treated also to be, one has to take care in terms of how this applies in different countries.
Sure. So does it also, let's say, apply, do you also have a couple of lines about, what about then the boards of family controlled companies? Because a lot of our cohort members are coming from such backgrounds.
Absolutely. And here again, where we've got a family controlled company, and it's less a question therefore of the shareholders who's having interests which are different from those of the people on the board. In other words, it is controlled by the same entity as holds the shares. Then again, some of these issues don't apply. On the other hand, some people will also either are or will be on boards in which they are not members of the family, and that therefore gives rise to obviously issues for them about how do they operate in this environment, which is very different.
Right. Now it comes to the next question is then, should the boards have committees, and should executives other than CEO and CFO sit on these boards? It's quite debatable.
Yeah, well, it is. I mean, in relation to committees, I don't think there's a question about this. As soon as a company gets more than a certain size, you can't expect the board to do everything, because otherwise board meetings would be far too long and would have far too much detail. And it's right that they should, if possible, create committees to deal with certain regular matters, audit committees, for example, or remuneration committees for larger organizations, or ad hoc committees to deal with particular issues. And that means the board then doesn't, as a whole, have to think about every single item. It can perhaps get a report from a group of its members, and it has to trust them, of course, in order to decide then what to do. And so committees seem to me essential to this. You're on mute. You're on mute.
Boards are at the top, and
sorry.
How do then boards improve? How they function?
Okay, so, oh, by the way, sorry, I didn't answer the second part of your question, which is, should executives other than the CEO and CFO sit on the board?
Yes.
In the listed companies, certainly in the environment here in the UK and in some other countries, on the whole, there's a question about whether other executives should sit on the board. Now that's quite tough, because if you're a marketing director of a company, of a listed company, you may feel you want to sit on the board, but it puts you in a quite difficult position as to what your role is, because the CEO speaks for the executive on a listed company board, and therefore begs the question, what's the role of the other people on the board? Sorry, can I just go back to, I missed that question. Let me go back to that.
Sure, no problem. Thank you. Now, my question was, board is at the top. How do they improve? How do they function?
Well, one of the for those who are not familiar with it, I mean, one of the ways in which boards can improve is by making sure that they get themselves a board appraisal as a group from time to time. And so this is a requirement for listed companies in some countries, where you have to have somebody coming in advising the board about how to do things better. You can do this too internally, though it's more complicated. But above all, I would say, particularly if you're serving on a board for the first time and there is no board appraisal, my view would be you need to get feedback, because quite often, in my experience, if you don't have appraisal, people don't know how well or badly they're doing. And this is a pity, because everybody wants to do well on a board. And so it's dependent on the chairman, particularly, to give that feedback. And so again, my advice is, if you're not getting feedback, ask for some, because otherwise, how do you know how to improve?
I am aware of employee appraisal, but I was not aware that there is also board appraisal. Good to know. So now, then what are the qualities of a good board member?
Okay, well, look, this is what you want from a board member is obviously somebody who knows about what they're talking about, whatever that might be. But I made a list of, I thought, what the particular issues were in which somebody should have. And I start off with something that is so obvious that you might think it amazing that I mention it. and that is that somebody should read the papers before the meeting. I mean, I have been in a number of boards where it's quite clear that people have not read the papers. They've asked questions which showed they've not read the papers. You do, I mean, you again, you may find this surprising, but the fact that you've actually read and understood the papers before is a great start as a board member, and that's in terms of. The second one is, I think one should focus on the whole organization. Your specialty may be marketing or finance or whatever it is, but what you want to do is to focus on the whole organization as a board member. And demonstrating you can do that is one of the ways in which people who are functional heads in human resources or marketing or strategy can demonstrate that they can move up to the chief executive slot. You know what I mean? So that business of demonstrating your ability to look at the whole picture, not just a part of it. The ability to think strategically and not just in response to the particular things that come along to the board, that seems to me, again, particularly important. What you've got to be able to do, there's a number of tensions here. You've got to be able to challenge, especially challenge other members, but you've got to challenge constructively. If you're always destructive, always, you know, you'll get yourself a bad reputation. So the challenge has to be a constructive challenge. You have to be part of the team, but not simply go along with what everybody else says. In other words, to be able to show you can be independent, but not so independent that you become impossible to work with. You've got to demonstrate, as I said before, you've got to demonstrate expertise, but also have that wider view. In terms of knowledge, you know, you need to be knowledgeable, but not endlessly to be telling people, you know, that you're cleverer than they are. You know what I mean? That gives you a very bad reputation. I mean, you need to be very careful how you interact with people and phrase things and so on. You need to show that you're, especially if you're a non-executive director, that you can be independent of the board and yet committed. And this again is a quite difficult thing to do. How can you stand outside and yet be committed to what's going on? And also finally, you've got to make sure that you look at the interests of all the stakeholders and not just one particular group, even though your temptation may be to push the interests of that group. So being a director, I think, is quite a complicated role, but also potentially a very rewarding one.
I find that comment very interesting when you say that you need to ensure that you don't tell everybody all the time that you are how intelligent you are than the others. Interesting to know how you do that. So I mean, my next question is then, what are then the traps a board member should avoid? Is it probably one of the traps, or?
Yes, I think that, you know, there are, I mean, that is definitely one of the traps. You know, if I think about the question of, you know, the sort of tricks and traps, one of the tricks, I think, is to try and identify what kinds of things you can best make a contribution to. It's good also to know how you can read the room, you know what I mean, to make sure that it's not just your ego that's involved, that you understand what's going on inside the group. There are, for one thing, for example, you might want to do is, you know, find an area in which you specialize or get a little more expertise, you know, to help you broaden out from the area of expertise you've got now. These are the kind of things you can do to make a contribution. And the kind of traps one has got, I think, is to think, you know, to a rigidity of thinking is one of the issues, I think, that's particularly a problem for a number of directors, where they become entrenched in one idea and they don't demonstrate that they can move out of that to do something more. One particular thing that comes to mind is, there's so many, I don't want, I can spend the rest of the time on this, but can I just suggest one thing, which is, if you've got a point you want to raise, often it's better to raise it before the meeting with somebody to clarify something, rather than raising it in the meeting and waste everybody's time, clarifying something that bluntly should have been done beforehand. So for me, this sort of tricks and traps area is think about what is good for the organization and what is good for the group, not what is good for you. That would be my summary.
Great. So after covering these general questions, let's talk about something from your own personal experiences. So as I already mentioned that you have vast experience and already sat on 17 boards, still counting. So out of those experiences, what board you have most enjoyed?
Well, I think my enjoyment has come from two things. One is from being involved, and that usually means smaller organizations. So I started my own company, and I really enjoyed being on the board of that because I was the only director, and that was really fun because you kind of ran your own show, and that was great. I'm only kidding, but I mean, it was kind of, you know, it's nice to be very involved. And so the smaller organizations that I've been involved in, I found satisfying for that reason. The larger organizations have been very, very interesting. So I've sat on the board, as you mentioned, of the Bank of England, and being on that board during the financial crisis was certainly fascinating. But also sitting on the board of Barclays was also during the financial crisis was extremely interesting. And there you have a sense of this is something where the subject matter is fascinating. So you're involved in something very interesting. So for me, it's either because I'm personally excited by something because it's quite small and intimate, or it's very big and you've got these fascinating issues to resolve.
So now, having talked about best or enjoyed, best experiences, do you also have something which you have least enjoyed?
Well, I was on the board of I was chairman of a small company which ran a chain of bookshops. And the difficulty there was there were two shareholders, neither of whom could agree with each other. And so it was very frustrating. So being on a board where you're frustrated all the time is difficult. And again, I think that's something which, if you are asked to get involved in something of that kind, and you feel this is not going to work, this is, you can see that there are factions or things like that, that can be really a depressing thing to do. So that I think is the one area that I would perhaps pick out as being something which was not an enjoyable experience. Oh, I should mention one other thing, by the way, which was probably the least enjoyable of anything I did, which was, it was my last year on the Barclays board when there was the crisis, the LIBOR scandal broke, and that we were involved in that, and that was very unpleasant and difficult. And then being involved in an organization which has scandal attached to it, I think is very difficult indeed. So that was certainly not enjoyable.
Would you like to tell us who is the best board member you have ever seen so far?
Well, I've seen a lot, and I would pick out an LBS alumnus.
Interesting.
He was actually on the Sloan program, and he was a man of very humble origin, who his parents worked in as clerks, and he worked himself up through sheer ability, and he then he ran the post office in the UK, and he became a very senior figure. There's a man called Ron Deering. He went into the House of Lords. Now, that was not because, he had connections or anything. It was because he was a very, very able man. And I sat on a board where he was the chairman, and he was a wonderful chairman, because what he would do is he would move the business very, very quickly through. He wouldn't push anybody. He wouldn't rush anybody. He would make sure everybody had the opportunity to speak. And yet his meetings went very quick because, he summarized things. He said, do I take it? This is what we agree on. This is what we agree on. He was a brilliant chairman. So there we are, an LBS alumnus Roy Deering, I nominate.
Great. So what is the worst thing about being on a board, and what is the best?
Okay. the worst thing, I can't think of the worst thing of the board at the moment. I think the best thing, look, in terms of one's personal opportunities and what one can, it, as an experience, if one is involved in something that is interesting and you feel committed to and involved in, and that's a wonderful thing to do in any field, whether you're on a board or doing private life, whatever it is. And so I think the best thing really is about the chance to get involved in something which is different and new. If you're, sorry, I'm speaking now as a non-executive director, forgive me. That's for a non-executive director. For an executive director, I mean, obviously this is something where they have the opportunity to wield influence. This is a great opportunity, not just for oneself, as it were, but for the organization. And I think that working, especially if one works with a group of great colleagues, it's, like working with a good team in any situation, it's a wonderful thing to do. So I would think that's the best. Oh yes, I tell you what the worst thing is. In my experience, almost all meetings are too long, all right? Too long. Most agenda items are too long. And so I get very impatient because if you can see after 10 minutes, you can see exactly what the conclusion is. So why do you spend another 15 minutes discussing it? With my, it's going to be, the answer is going to be yes. So unless somebody else got something brilliant to say, my view is, one should shut up. So the difficulty is some meetings are very long. That's the worst aspect.
Great. So you were also the deputy chairman of the Tavistock and Portman NHS Trust. What learnings did you take from the time there?
Well, being on a health trust, I think, is like being on a board of any public sector organization. It involves a lot of responsibility. You're dealing with people's well-being. You're dealing, with things that are not just, the interests of the shareholders. I learned a lot from that in terms of the way in which one has to balance very complicated objectives within an organization. And I would say that is one thing that is more complicated for public bodies, where the balance is tough. You've got stakeholders, and balancing the interest of those stakeholders, I think, is particularly difficult. So that's one thing I learned from that. I learned a lot. I was on the board for quite a long time. And this was a mental health trust. Again, difficult issues involved there. So that was something I very much benefited from.
Interesting. Now, when we were discussing about this board experiences, we got a very common question that, let's say, I'm just going to read it now, that the question is typically I'm not in a senior position right now, but I want to get to a board as a career progression. And how do I get there? What strategic decisions do I need to take in my career? And what is the time scale we are talking about?
Well, look, I sympathize with this because let's say hypothetically one wants to get board experience and one hasn't got any board experience, and it's a catch-22. People say to you, "Oh, yeah, fine. What board experience have you got?" And you say none. They say, "Oh, well, thank you very much." Next.
Exactly.
So my advice is to try and find often quite low-level bodies which are interested in having people on their boards who have wider experience. So for example, it might be the governors of a school. It might be a local charitable body, whatever it is. By getting some experience on a board, you start to build up credibility. If you've got on one board, then you can move to another board. Particularly if one does well on a board and people say, "Oh, he's a terrific contributor," you can move then to another board, perhaps rather larger, and so on. And that would be my advice about the best way to do it, because it's quite difficult to get yourself onto boards. The other way, and it's not something that I feel very comfortable about talking about at a meritocratic institute such as the London Business School, is that frankly, a lot of people get on boards because of people they know. And, you know, so it's worth thinking about if you know somebody who you think may be in a position to help you get on a board, to get that experience, about going and talking to them. So that's the thing. I've also thought about a third one, which somebody gave me a tip. And as I said, at one stage when I wasn't in any boards, I'd been out of circulation for a while, I said, I'm interested in getting back into this. And he said to me, all right, so what boards would you like to go on? So I said, well, this and this. So he said, well, why don't you just write to the chairman? So I realized that's not an easy thing to do. I mean, at that stage, I'd got quite a lot of experience and credibility. But all I'm saying is, if you see an organization which you think you can contribute to, it's worthwhile just writing perhaps to the chairman and saying, well, look, you know, I'm interested in joining the board. Could we perhaps have a talk and chat about it? You know, what can you lose? The person can say no, you know what I mean? But yes, not everybody will say no. You know? Right. There's three ways.
Nothing to lose. So thank you. So now let's come out of this. Let's start talk about other things. So in general, what are you currently working on?
Well, are you thinking about boards or?
Yes, yes, and in general, yes.
I'm just on the boards front. So I'm on 3 very interesting boards at the moment. I'm on the boards of Times newspapers. So that's very interesting because that's about the media and it's about the independence of the media and so on. And that's a subsidiary board. So the main board is in New York. So I'm only on the board of the newspapers here in the UK. I'm on the board of an insurance company, Beazley, and I enjoy that because that is a very well-run company, you know, and the sense of here's a company with a good management team, very focused, very professional. So that's a pleasure for those reasons. And I'm also on the board of a small startup bank that is trying to start up in these very difficult times. And that's interesting because that's a small organization. So those are 3 things I'm involved in for the moment.
Fantastic.
But otherwise, and this links to the boards. So my research at the moment is on managerial judgment. What is it? How do you know people have got it? How can you improve your own? And that's something that I'm very, very interested in. I'm publishing in, and it applies to boards because boards in the UK are required, board members are required to show what's called independent judgment. And that is written into the legislation. But as I discovered, nobody has defined independent judgment. So in the last few weeks, I have defined independent judgment, and I'm hopeful, who knows, this might get some traction and be adopted, but we'll see.
Sure. So what does the future hold?
Well, I'm delighted to be on the faculty of the London Business School. I must tell you, when I walked into the London Business School, and I walked in before anybody watching this program was born, okay? And I felt in the air a kind of energy, a sort of vibrancy. And I've never lost that sense that it's an institution which is very vibrant, it's very exciting, people are, you know, interested in the future, they're dynamic, and it's a great place to work. So I love my lecturing, I love my research. If I can go on doing that, I shall be very happy.
From your perspective, what does it mean to be an LBS alumnus?
Well, I think it's a great position to be in because you have this fantastic network around the world. And I had the privilege as dean of visiting many faculty in different countries. And what was great was that here is a network, a chance anywhere you are to be able to talk to somebody, email somebody, whatever it is, you know what I mean, and have the chance to connect to people. And I think, and you know, on the whole, This is a very classy bunch, the LBS alumni. They are very capable, you know what I mean? And that, I think, is a great thing to have for the rest of one's career. I don't think it's not just a question of saying, you know, picking up one's bag and saying, I've got a degree and that's the end of the story. And I very much hope that everybody uses the alumni network and indeed contributes to it. You know, it's great also if people contact you to say, yes, yeah, I'm happy to help if I can. You know what I mean? So terrific to be an alumnus.
Students often get tips on which books to read and all. So may I ask you which book you are reading now, currently?
Oh, so I'm reading a book called What Computers Still Can't Do. And it's a classic book. It's a classic book because I'm looking, my work on judgment, I'm looking at the relationship between judgment and artificial intelligence. So I'm trying to answer the question, is it possible that a machine can exercise judgment? Because the answer to that question is important. You know, obviously if a machine can't exercise judgment, it has implications for the kinds of jobs people are going to have in the future. And so that seems to be particularly important. But I mean, a book which I recently read and which I've already recommended to a number of people, which in relation to this is called Deep Medicine by an American doctor called Eric Topol. And that deals with the question of the arrival of artificial intelligence in medicine. And I think it's a fascinating book about how machines can in some cases do much better than people, and in other cases, not at all as well. And he has a very cheerful conclusion, which is actually machines won't just supersede people, doctors. Machines will work with doctors better.
Oh, on that note, I would like to end today's talk. Thank you so much, Sir Likierman, for coming on today. We look forward to speaking to you once again very soon. Thank you.
Very much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.